Some people seem to be obsessed with finding fault with the Bible. Well, they don't like what it says, so they put a lot of energy into trying to discredit it. But there's little new to be said about the Bible. It's been completed in its present form for about 2,000 years, and all during that time it's been very carefully studied. Most of the alleged contradictions and imagined errors have been laid aside centuries ago, but enthusiastic fault finders dig them up thinking they've found something new. But since the Bible was written in real languages, the normal rules of interpreting literature should apply. Unfortunately, many of the critics don't seem to know those rules and how they work, and if they do, well, they have an emotional barrier that keeps them from using them consistently, particularly when it comes to interpreting things written in the Bible. A while ago, I was sent a blog article that repeated a whole long list of old errors. They were ones I've been aware of for a long time, but they were real errors, but not errors made in the Bible. They were century-old errors made by interpreters of a book about which these critics seem to know very little. This particular article was primarily trying to prove a contradiction between biblical texts about God's visibility. It listed some texts where it says that someone had seen God. Then it contrasted them with other passages where the Bible says no one has seen God, no one can see God. His prime examples he quoted were from Genesis 32:30 and John 1:18. Now, he appears to have used the Old King James Bible, translated in 1611. It's a good translation, but again, it's based upon English that was used commonly back several hundred years ago. And in Genesis 32:30, it says that Jacob wrestled with a man till dawn to receive a blessing from him. Then he named the place Peniel, which means in Hebrew, the face of God. Then Jacob said, "For I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved." Then the critic makes reference to John 1:18, where it says, "No man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him." And so the blogger anticipates how he thinks Christians are going to explain away this alleged contradiction. He doesn't seem to have really read what actual Bible scholars say about the passages. If he used their commentaries, well, I suggest he go back and read more carefully. But more likely, he gathered his information from some very poorly informed sources, of which there are many out there. But in his attempt to find a contradiction between these well-known verses, he ends up attacking and discrediting certain normal principles of literary interpretation. Not just methods of interpretation of the Bible, but the way we approach any piece of literature to interpret it. And he goes after three main principles. Two of them are very crucial and important in looking at this particular passage. So, to understand the verses cited, we need to take a look at the principles that are involved in understanding them. In any passage, first we take a look at what we call lexicography. It tells us the meanings of the words used in a sentence. Secondly, we take a look at the context. It tells us how words fit in with what the original author is saying. Well, first, let's take a look at lexicography, because that's a very important part. It's the study of the meaning of the words themselves. And I'm including in that somewhat grammar as well, because it has to do with the forms of the words and how they fit together in a sentence. What's a noun, what's an adjective, what's a verb, what tense they have, what relationship they have with one another as the grammar pieces these words together. But most words in any language have multiple meanings depending on how they're being used in a particular context. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew. Let me show you Hebrew Bible here. This is what a Hebrew Bible looks like. A little different type alphabet than most of us are used to seeing, but once you read through it, you begin to get a good idea of what the language is like. So a decent understanding of this is mandatory for scholars, but we need to take a look at the individual words that are being used there so that we can tell what they mean. If you don't happen to know a word, even in English, what do? You look it up to see what it says. And so we have certain dictionaries and lexicons where we can look up the meanings of words. One of the great ones that people use a lot is this one, the Brown Driver and Briggs lexicon of the Old Testament, and it has all the words of the Old Testament in it. Now, if you look through this, you'll see that each of the words has a whole long article written about it. I can't show you all of them because it would take too long to go through examples and so forth here. We'll be doing that perhaps in some of our future studies to take a look at particular words. But as you look, some of the words take up page or column after column, and some go page after page, because words can have many different meanings depending on how they're being used. Some words have different forms. Some words are simply used differently depending on what we're talking about. And so we look up the words in a lexicon like this so we can find out what particularly they're talking about. We need to look at the range of meanings that each word has and take a close look at what the possibilities are for what it might mean in the particular context we're looking at. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek. It was a Greek that was used commonly back in the early days of the New Testament. This is a Greek New Testament, and it happens to be a page from Luke. Katlikon means according to Luke. And there's all the words that are on that particular page. So again, we need to look up each word and find out what they mean. This is a common lexicon used for early Greek language studies. Not just the New Testament, but other literature written in that first century. And again, like the other one in Hebrew, each word has a long list of meanings. You look up the words, you can see how they're used in each context. And it tells you examples. It shows you how it's being used. It's not just telling you what the word means. It's showing you how the word is actually used in each of the contexts where the word appears. And it gives you citations so that you can look things up further if you really wanted to. But again, sometimes words can take up page after page after page, and sometimes words have just 3-4 meanings to them, and they're very easy then when we go back and look at the context. This is a particularly favorite book of mine. This is a vocabulary lexicon by Moulton Milligan. It's a first century Greek. But in this case, it takes the words and it gives you examples that were actually found by people who were ordinary folks writing letters to home, like from soldiers, or children writing to their parents who were away. Sometimes inscriptions that were found in marketplaces where they were recording transactions of business taking place. Notations written by various authors of the day. And even sometimes orders which were written by commanders to soldiers out in the field. And so you can actually see how each of the words were being used. It gives you the actual context there, so you can read it and see how it was being used. He doesn't just tell you what it means, he shows you what it means. So these books are extremely valuable, but we have to remember that words all have a variety of meanings. Now, only a very inattentive first-year language student could believe that you look at all the meanings and you just pick the one that you want it to wherever you want the passage to say. We have to look and find out what it means in the context. Now, the blogger assumes that if we want to defend the Bible, we just dig through these dictionaries and find a word that eliminates the obvious contradiction. Of course, in making up his argument, what he's doing is picking out the meanings that produce an inconsistency. So the question is, how do we really know then which meaning is the correct one in each case where we find the words? Well, the key again is context. We look to see how the word is being used in any particular place, how it fits the flow of thought and the point being made in each passage by its author. That's how the list of meanings got into the dictionary or lexicon in the first place. The literary principle here is called usus loquendi. It considers how a word is used in a particular location, a particular place where it appears. And the meanings are drawn from the context in which the word is used by the native speakers of that language at that particular time. But when we look at the passages that are quoted by our blogger who's attacking Christianity here in the Bible, There's two different contexts in the verses that he's quoted. In fact, they're separated by many centuries of time. Were written in totally different situations, written in different languages even. And it's a fundamental linguistic error to force the same meaning upon a word in every place that it's used. And since the meanings of words are determined by how they're used, the blogger attacks the context. And he argues that the context of a word is meaningless, whereas he says simple declarative statements are involved. So in other words, you can't trust the context. If something declares something, well, regardless of what the context is, we just take it at one particular meaning. But of course we just saw that words in different contexts, though they all declare something, can have very different meanings. He fails to understand that almost everything we say is in some sense declarative. It declares something to be true. But he makes an argument to support his theory, and he cites a mathematical inequality as evidence that context doesn't matter. He points out that the context can't make the statement 2 equals 3 to be true. But declaring something to be true that's obviously not true is not what we're dealing with here. The statements being considered in the Bible are not isolated inequalities. The blogger makes a fundamental error that we learn about way back in Logic 101. It's called the error of the undistributed middle term. The meaning of the words are defined in each case by the point being made by the author. But the common element that he observes here, the concept of seeing God, is used as something very different in each place. Genesis 32 describes a historical incident in the life of Jacob. John 1 is a narrative telling about how God was entering into the world in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, the context of 1 John is really the key to understanding the point being made in both passages. John's Gospel, chapter 1, begins by telling us that the Word became flesh. The Word, of course, is the expression of truth from God, His revelation. And it tells us that the Word was, in fact, God. The very first verse concludes with that expression, and grammatically, if you study it honestly, it simply says that the Word was God. John explains, as you read on through verse 14, that Word he's talking about that became flesh and lived among us was Jesus Christ. And then he goes on to describe the life of Christ and how he influenced the world, being God in human flesh here. Jesus took on a human nature to further reveal and carry out God's plan of redemptive history. There are many places in the Bible where the invisible God manifests himself in a physical form to communicate something to somebody. We in fact call these appearances theophanies. They're well documented. John was well acquainted with them. The whole point of John 1 is to show that God took on a human nature. Jesus of Nazareth, the invisible Creator, was revealing himself to us by means of something visible. So there's no way that this contradicts anything here. It doesn't contradict the fact that God is a spirit being, and therefore we can't actually see him since he's a spirit and we don't see spirits. John is pointing out that we see God through the appearing of the eternal Son in the person of Jesus. We can't physically see God as an eternal spirit, but he does make himself known to us in our physical world in ways that we would understand as physical beings. Now, commentators on Genesis have taken this particular passage in different ways. They have different understandings of exactly what Jacob saw there. It tells us that he wrestled with this man until dawn. Some suggest that the wrestling of Jacob was just figurative, describing his struggle with God in prayer. A few take that particular view. But some take the idea that maybe it was a physical manifestation of an angel sent from God. In fact, in the prophet Hosea chapter 12, verses 3 to 5, it makes reference to several incidents in the life of Jacob. In verse 4, it actually refers to the same incident spoken of here in Genesis 32. Hosea 12:4 says, "Yea, he hath power, or had power over the angel, and prevailed." So there, instead of saying over the man that he struggled with, Here in Hosea it says it was an angel to describe the one that Jacob was wrestling with, struggling with. Now, the word angel in both the Old and New Testaments is simply a word that means messenger, someone sent to represent someone to deliver a message. And the spirit angels in the Bible are invisible spirit beings. They were messengers, sometimes sent from God, to represent Him and to communicate something from Him to humans. But these purely spirit messengers, in order to do that, took on human forms to carry out that purpose. Now, some say that Jacob was actually struggling with a manifestation of God Himself, appearing in some human form that He caused to exist for that particular incident, like a pre-incarnate form of Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, the one who generally is the person of the Trinity conceived of as communicating with us humans. And so these who take that view remind us that Jesus came as a messenger from God, and therefore the term angel would apply to Him as well. I remember when I was studying classical literature in Greek and Hebrew, the same words in the Bible that are used for angel were often used in military writings of a messenger that was sent from the general to the front lines to communicate something to the soldiers that were there. They didn't have walkie-talkies in those days or cell phones, and so they would send a runner, a messenger, an angel. So an angel will be any messenger. So whichever definition or explanation you choose on understanding Genesis passage, in Genesis 32, the messenger represented God, who sent him to communicate something to Jacob. And through this appearing, Jacob beheld the very face of God as represented by this messenger. It's clear that the invisible God did at times appear in physical forms. Let me put up a graphic on that. It might help a little bit here. These are the two passages that we've been looking at. In Genesis 32:30, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. But before that, it mentioned his wrestling with a man. And remember, in Hosea, it talks about him wrestling with an angel. John 1:18, it says, no man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, He hath declared Him. So, it's clear that the invisible God did in fact appear at times in physical form, both personally and through His messengers to communicate with us. It's not that God's nature is in itself physical rather than pure spirit. Both contexts are about the invisible God manifesting Himself in some visible and physical form. It's careless investigation to isolate a line from a historical narrative like the one in Genesis 32 and then use it as if it contradicts the very same type situation in John chapter 1. The third general principle that this blogger attacks has to do with the integrity of the text itself. He says very boldly that when no other explanation works, Bible defenders just say the words must have been miscopied. Well, every Bible student knows that we don't have the original manuscripts of the Bible written by Moses and Jeremiah and the Apostle Paul. They've been lost for a very long time. But we have copies. We have thousands of very ancient copies made in all different places around the ancient world at that time. And we can compare them, and we can see where errors sometimes did in fact creep in. But we can correct it because we see the mass of manuscripts, and suddenly a different reading pops up over here in Egypt or something, and it's copied on several Egyptian manuscripts. We see that that was an isolated incident. By comparing these geographically, lexicography studies are applied to it. We take a look at the actual forms that the letters were written in. We date them. And we can very easily reconstruct the text of the Bible. The largest percent of the differences that we see in these manuscripts was just trivial matters of spelling. Spelling wasn't standardized then as it is now. It wasn't studied in the same way that we have it. We see in all ancient literature that words are spelled differently in different places at different times. This is long before there were printed dictionaries or spell checkers to help us out with that. But there's no such textual problems present here in the passages that he cited. No competent Bible scholar ever said that the words in these passages were miscopied. Aside from that, The blogger shows no understanding of how textual studies are actually done. We only recognize variations in a text when they actually appear in some of the ancient manuscripts, some of the copies that we have. We don't just assume that it must be miscopied simply because we don't like what it says. And so we only recognize these variations when we actually find them. And there's plenty of reference materials and documents on variations in the copies of the biblical text. And they're available in electronic Bible tools designed for our computers in regular book form. For example, I showed you my Hebrew Bible before. In the footnotes at the bottom are any notations where differences appeared in the text that we have, the different scrolls of the Old Testament, and different translations of it. So if there are little variations, we'll be aware of them. As I said, almost all of them are simply just matters of spelling, or where one long stroke was actually made a little too short, and they mistook it for a short stroke. And those happen to be two different letters in the Hebrew alphabet. But they don't change the meaning of the paragraphs and the teachings in the Word. The New Testament does the same. In the New Testament, below the text, we have a place where it documents all the different readings in various papyri and uncial texts that we have that have come down to us. And so we can be aware when there is a difference. We can see, oh yeah, here in this particular place, some scholar probably wrote something in the margin, and the next guy copied it, put it in the text. But we see it suddenly appearing at this point in history and in this particular location, so we understand that it wasn't in the older copies that are better documented, that have been spread into many different places around the world. Now, there's errors in older copies too, so just being old doesn't make them the best. We studied this very carefully. In fact, they even have entire books. This particular book was written simply to explain the choices that certain committees have made when they have put together a particular text to use for the translation of the Bible that they were doing. And so we can look that up very easily and study it. And of course, all these documents that we have here are not only available in book form, but they're available for our portable devices. Here's one that I have on my iPad. And again, it discusses the meanings of different texts and so forth, and helps us to understand how the text came to be what it is, so we can know exactly any differences that might occur. You can even get it for your telephones, your little cell phones, and look up all this stuff. But virtually all these books that I showed you are available on the internet, and available. You can download them or buy them for your computer. They're all available to everybody. And so when these variations occur, we evaluate the variations that might occur in the texts, and we keep in mind this. But no responsible interpreter simply assumes that the words of a text must have been changed. And again, the argument shows a very naive understanding of the whole process of textual studies. And so the critical blogger violates these three basic principles of literature in interpreting it. First of all, lexicography. Words do not always have the same meaning in every context, and so he rejects the basic principle of usus loquendi. Also, declarative statements in the Bible are highly influenced by their context, and he violates the basic rule of formal logic in his attempt to prove his assumption. Third, the ancient manuscripts are reconstructed by comparing and evaluating our existing copies. He assumes that defenders of the Bible just invent better readings to defend their beliefs. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so, in all fairness, the blogger has obviously not really studied the basics of interpreting the Scripture literarily. And he also exhibits a common tendency to let our assumptions color our thinking. But, we can understand this when he's approaching it with a certain desire to prove that the Bible is wrong. When we come with assumptions to a particular question, it tends to make us overlook the flaws in our own reasoning if it helps us to reach our conclusion. Well, I hope you can see my point. Now, of course, there's no literal physical point or dot here to see. I've contradicted myself, huh? Asking you to see something that isn't physically there? Well, I have no doubt that the context and the ordinary rules of understanding language made you understand what I said very clearly when I said, I hope you can see my point. When the Bible is carefully interpreted, you have no problem understanding its clear and obvious meaning, unless you start by assuming that there must be a contradiction to find. Assumptions prejudice our approach to a problem and will ensure that we find whatever it is we expect to find, if it's really there, or even if it's not.